The Galactic Council turned on humanity. They didn't expect what woke up. The vote was not supposed to be close. That was the first thing Ambassador Yara Osei noticed when the council chamber's atmosphere recyclers fell silent. The kind of silence that precedes not deliberation but verdict. She had been sitting in the human delegation's booth for 11 hours. The booth smelled faintly of recycled Theresi atmosphere, a compromise the council architects had built into every chamber, a blend of oxygen ratios calibrated for the 17 recognized species, satisfying no one completely. Yara had long ago stopped noticing it. She noticed it now. The convener, a Drell named HFY, its carapace the color of old copper, raised 3 of its limbs in the gesture that meant finality. On the translation feed threading through Yara's earpiece, the Drell word came through as, sealed. The Council of Recognized Species, HFY began, its vocalizer producing the common tongue in the flat register of ceremony, has considered the matter of humanity's escalating unilateral expansion into the Kethra buffer zone, the unauthorized terraforming of Lock 7, and the continued refusal to submit colony registration to the Cartography Authority. Yara had heard all 3 charges before. She had answered them before. She had submitted 314 pages of documentation demonstrating that Lock 7 had been uninhabited, that the buffer zone protocols predated humanity's membership and had been drafted without human input, and that the Cartography Authority's backlog was measured in decades. The documentation sat somewhere in council archives, filed and unanswered. The council finds, HFY continued, in favor of Proposal 879er. ****. Proposal 879 had a longer formal name. In council language it translated to something like, Corrective Isolation Measure for Non-Compliant Member Species. The humans who had read it in advance, and there had been some, in the intelligence offices on Earth and Meridian Station, had been calling it something shorter. The cage. The cage meant no human vessel permitted beyond a defined perimeter without council escort. It meant trade routes reclassified as restricted. It meant the technology-sharing agreements that had been quietly feeding human medical research for 30 years were terminated, effective immediately. It meant the 3 human colony ships currently in transit, the Indus, the Sao Paulo, and the agricultural vessel Grain Road, were to be intercepted and redirected. Yara had a prepared statement. She did not read it. She looked instead at the delegation from the Keth hegemony, the ones who had written the proposal, and she found Preeter Dovanash watching her with the wide, translucent pupils of a predator waiting to see how prey responds to the net closing. She held its gaze long enough to make the point she intended, that she was not prey, and had not yet decided what she was. Then she closed her translation feed, gathered her documentation tablet and walked out. The hallway outside the council chamber was a curved corridor of polished black stone that the Drell had quarried from an asteroid and transported here as a gift when the station was built. It was meant to imply permanence. Yara walked its length quickly, feeling the slight variance in gravity. The station ran at 0.94 standard, another compromise, and pulled out her communicator. Fleet Admiral Soren Brecht answered on the second pulse. He was on Meridian Station, 12 light minutes away, which meant he had been waiting with his communicator in hand. It passed, she said. A pause, not transmission lag, she knew. He had heard. He was choosing his next words the way she had seen him choose them before. Carefully, because the ones he chose now would travel outward from this moment in ways neither of them could fully track. How many votes against? 3. Ourselves, the Fun Collective, and the Miru. The Miru voted with us. Yes. Another pause. The Miru were small, a single-system species, barely Class 2 by council metrics, but they had long memories and longer grudges against the Keth hegemony. It was not nothing. All right, Brecht said. He did not say we expected this, though they had. He did not say the contingency plans are active, though they were. What he said was, come home, Yara. She looked back once at the black stone corridor, at the corridor that had been meant to mean permanence, and walked toward the dock where her shuttle waited. Behind her, in the council chamber, 17 species were already discussing implementation timelines. Not one of them had served on a military vessel. Not one had spent a winter in a habitat dome waiting for supply ships that might not come. Not one had ever been told that the oxygen quota was being reduced and to please sleep more efficiently. They knew a great deal about humanity. They had studied the species thoroughly before admitting them and more thoroughly since. They knew about the wars, the resource consumption, the stubborn refusal to accept collective authority without demanding justification. They knew humans were difficult. What they did not know, what they could not quite process because their civilizations had each been stable for centuries or millennia before contact, was what humans were like when things became genuinely hard. They were about to find out. The contingency plans had a name no one had officially given them. The people who worked on them called them, informally and without particular drama, the drawer plans, because that was where they lived, in a secured archive on Meridian Station that the relevant officers accessed the way people access a desk drawer, with the casual ease of something they opened regularly. Director Priya Sandoval had been opening that drawer, in one form or another, for 9 years. She was not a general. She was not an admiral. Her official title was Director of Strategic Infrastructure Assessment, which was accurate and described almost nothing useful about what she actually did. What she actually did was maintain a running model of what humanity could sustain independently, industrially, medically, militarily, agriculturally, if every external relationship was severed simultaneously. She updated the model quarterly. She briefed exactly 4 people on its outputs. She had never, in 9 years, needed to brief anyone on the planet implied. She was briefing those 4 people now, in a room that did not appear on any station schematic. The critical gap is still pharmacological, she said, advancing the display. The room was small, the table was old, and the display was very good. 31 compounds currently sourced from collective trade routes, 9 of which have no synthesized analog yet. We have 18-month stockpiles on 6 of them. The other 3 are narrower, 6 months, maybe 8 if we reduce non-critical dispensing. Define non-critical, said Admiral Brecht. Maintenance prescriptions. Long-term comfort medications. Things that aren't going to kill you in 6 months if you stop, but are going to make those 6 months uncomfortable. She advanced the display again. I don't recommend rationing, by the way. I recommend that our synthesis teams have been underfunded for 4 years and we correct that immediately. Done, said the civilian administrator to Brecht's left. A woman named Keller who ran the Meridian budget and had the specific energy of someone who had long suspected this moment was coming and was almost relieved to stop suspecting it. What else? Food is fine. We've been quietly net positive on caloric production for 6 years. The Lock 7 colony was part of that strategy, incidentally, which is perhaps why the council objected to it so strenuously. Sandoval allowed herself a small pause there. Energy is fine. Propulsion is fine. Materials are tight but manageable. Ships. Brecht asked. Here is where it gets interesting. Asterisk. The human fleet, by council metrics, was modest. 32 registered warships, all disclosed under membership treaty requirements. 211 registered civilian transports. 47 research and survey vessels. The human fleet by actual count was larger. This was not a secret kept from the council through active deception, or not entirely. It was kept through the specific opacity of bureaucracy, which is perhaps the most reliable form of concealment. Things that are technically filed, technically accessible, but buried in sufficiently unremarkable documentation that no one with investigative authority had ever thought to look twice. The additional vessels were classified variously as experimental platforms, civil engineering support, survey auxiliaries, reserve hulls, and, in 31 cases, dry-docked maintenance vessels that had been, over the past 8 years, quietly returned to operational status. Fleet Admiral Brecht knew about these ships. He had been quietly ensuring their operational status, one budget line at a time, since before Sandoval had started her assessment work. He was not a paranoid man. He was a man who had grown up in a colony habitat on Meridian's second moon, where the emergency oxygen reserves were tested every 90 days not as protocol but as genuine necessity, because the engineers who had installed them had never entirely trusted the seals. He had learned early that the difference between security and the feeling of security was usually a number on a gauge, and that the gauge was only trustworthy if someone had recently calibrated it. The intercept order, he said. The colony ships. The Indus received the council notification 4 hours ago, Sandoval said. Captain Adaora Iwu acknowledged it. She has not altered course. A silence moved around the table. She's waiting, Keller said. She's waiting, Brecht confirmed. He looked at the display, where the track of the Indus continued its original heading like a line drawn by someone who had decided a long time ago where they were going and found the interruption insufficient to change their mind. Tell her she has authorization to continue. Tell her, he stopped. Reconsidered the word authorization. Tell her the situation at home is understood and that her mission is unchanged. The council will view that as open defiance, Keller said. The council, Brecht said, voted 14-3 to put us in a cage. I find I am not enormously concerned with how they characterize our response. Asterisk asterisk asterisk. On Earth, the news had moved through the public information channels in a way that democratic information always moves. Unevenly, with wide variance in interpretation and a great deal of noise surrounding a relatively simple fact. The simple fact was, the species that humanity had spent 60 years trying to join as an equal had decided, by majority vote, that humanity was to be managed. The response, globally, was not panic. Panic would have been cleaner. What happened instead was a low, wide settling, a collective recalibration of something that had been quietly believed and was now quietly unbelieved. And out of that settling came a quality of attention that humans sometimes produce and that is difficult to describe except by its effects. Engineers went back to their terminals. Biologists pulled up synthesis research they had set aside. Shipyard workers on Ceres and Titan accepted overtime without being asked. In a laboratory in Nairobi, a team that had been 9 months from a viable synthetic analog of a fun-sourced anticoagulant worked through the weekend and collapsed the timeline to 11 weeks. None of this was organized. No one sent a directive. It was simply what happened when you told people who had built a civilization on a planet that wanted to kill them, who had survived ice ages and plagues and several serious attempts at self-destruction, that they were now on their own. They began to work. The way they always had. Without being asked. Without being certain it would be enough. Because certainty had never been a prerequisite for any of it. Raitor Dovanash of the Keth hegemony had served on the Galactic Council for 22 years. In that time it had seen 3 member species censured, 1 expelled, and 2 trade disputes that had nearly become shooting conflicts. It had, by its own estimate, a detailed and well-earned understanding of how political pressure worked. Its understanding had not previously included humanity. The problem was not the industry. The Indus was a single vessel, and single vessels, even ones that ignored council authority, were manageable. The problem was that 2 days after the Indus maintained course, survey records submitted to the Council Cartography Authority showed that there were 11 more colony vessels on similar headings. This was news to the Cartography Authority, which had been under the impression that human deep space colonization was a slower process. Dovanash called for an emergency session. The humans, it said to the assembled council, have been colonizing at more than 3 times the rate indicated in their registered declarations. Convener Essed of X Carapace shifted in the pattern that indicated, in Drell social language, something between discomfort and the specific feeling of realizing you have miscounted. Is this confirmed? The survey data is from our own instruments, Dovanash said. Yes, it is confirmed. The Fun Collective's representative, a being that communicated through a translator so sophisticated that its actual speech was entirely lost in translation, asked the question that was probably in everyone's mind, how? The answer, which the Council's intelligence analyst had spent 48 hours reconstructing and which Dovanash now delivered with an edge it was trying very hard not to show, was, slowly, quietly, and with enormous patience. Asterisk asterisk asterisk. Humanity had been a council member for 61 years. In that time they had learned, with the specific thoroughness of a species that reads every word of every contract it signs, exactly what the registration requirements said and exactly what they did not say. The requirements specified declared colonization vessels. They specified declared colony sites. They specified population thresholds above which reporting was mandatory. They did not specify anything about what happened before those thresholds. They did not specify anything about survey stations. They did not specify anything about agricultural infrastructure sites, which was a category that humans had apparently been using over the course of 2 decades, to establish the foundational material for colonies that simply hadn't yet crossed the population line. 47 sites. Across 9 systems. Each one technically a survey station or agricultural platform. Each one with domes, pressurized corridors, medical facilities, power generation, and, in 14 cases, children born on site who had never set foot on Earth. Dovanash stared at the display for a long time. They were already there, it said to no one in particular. They were already there, confirmed the intelligence analyst, a young Keth officer who had the expression of someone who has discovered a thing they would have strongly preferred not to discover. And we cannot enforce the intercept order because the intercept order specifies vessels in transit. These are facilities. They are not in transit. They are on the ground. Or in orbit in 11 cases, but stationary orbit with habitat attachment. The legal classification is ambiguous. The analyst paused. Also, several of them appear to have defensive installations. Defensive. As in, point defense systems. the kind used to intercept debris and micrometeors. Scaled considerably larger than standard in most cases. Ambassador Yara Osei received the request for a meeting from Praetor Dovanash via formal diplomatic channel. The slow one, the one that implied courtesy, 3 days after the council emergency session. She held the request for 12 hours before accepting. She met the Praetor in a neutral location, a small conference suite on the orbital way station above Meridian, which was technically not Earth territory but practically was. The room was functional, not impressive. Yara had chosen it deliberately. Dovanash had brought no aids. Neither had she. They sat across a plain table, and Yara found herself looking at the Keth Praetor the way she sometimes looked at difficult texts, searching for the load-bearing structure under the surface. "You knew," Dovanash said. "Was not a question." "We were prepared," Yara said. "There is a difference." The council did not understand the extent. The council, Yara said with a patience she had spent 11 hours refining, had full access to all filed documentation, all registration forms, all site declarations submitted over 61 years. We filed everything we were required to file. The requirement to investigate the implications of what we filed rested with the council, not with us. Dovanash's face, the Keth had faces, broad and flat with wide-set eyes, shifted in a way she had learned to read as something between anger and recalculation. It was choosing, she understood, between two different kinds of response. It chose the second kind. "What does humanity want?" it asked. Yara looked at it for a moment. Then she said, "Proposal 879 withdrawn. The buffer zone protocols renegotiated with human input. The cartography authority backlog addressed within 5 years. And if the council..." "The grain road," Yara said, "is an agricultural vessel. It is currently 6 weeks from Lock 7 with 2,000 colonists and enough seed stock for a viable independent food supply. The Indus and the Sao Paulo are behind it. There are 11 more behind them." She paused. "We are not asking for permission to exist, Praetor. We are extending an offer to remain in conversation while we do." Dovanash was quiet for a long time. Outside the way station's viewports, the stars were the same stars they had always been, the same stars humans had named and catalogued and stared at and eventually, inevitably, gone to. There was something in that, Yara thought. Something the council had perhaps calculated and still somehow failed to fully understand. Some things once set in motion do not stop because someone holds up a hand and says, "Wait." There was a Keth intelligence report, classified at the highest tier, circulated among perhaps 30 individuals across the hegemony, that had been written 14 months before the council vote. Its author was a senior analyst named Voradesh who had spent the preceding decade studying humanity and who had, in those 14 months, become quietly alarmed by something she could not fully articulate to colleagues who had not spent a decade studying humanity. The report was titled, in Keth bureaucratic language, something that translated roughly as, Assessment of Human Civilizational Stress Response Characteristics. Its central finding, stripped of the careful academic language Voradesh had wrapped it in, was this. When humans are threatened as a species, something changes in how they organize. Not in what they believe, not in their politics, not in their cultural output. These things remain varied, contentious, loud, and seemingly uncoordinated. What changes is their efficiency. A diffuse, argumentative species that in ordinary times cannot agree on a bus schedule will, under existential pressure, coordinate industrial output across 12 star systems without a centralized command structure giving any orders. Voradesh had struggled to explain how. The honest answer, which she had written in one draft and then removed, was, "We don't know. We have studied their history and we can see the pattern, but the mechanism is not clear." The report had been read by 30 people, considered briefly, and filed. The council vote had proceeded. ****. The mechanism, to the extent there was one, was not mysterious to the humans living it. It simply did not look like coordination from the outside because it was not coordination in the way most species practiced it, top-down, structured, visible. It looked, from the inside, like a conversation. A very large, very distributed, very intense conversation happening simultaneously in laboratories, shipyards, hydroponic bays, and orbital stations across human-occupied space. The conversation did not have a moderator. It did not have a fixed agenda. It had a problem, and problems were something humans had a very specific relationship with. On Ceres, the engineering collective that maintained the asteroid's mass drivers had been, for 3 years, quietly redesigning the facility's secondary systems for a purpose the official documentation described as throughput optimization. The actual purpose, known to the engineers, not documented anywhere official, was that a sufficiently optimized mass driver could deliver payloads to very precise orbital coordinates with very little advance warning. The engineers had not been asked to do this. They had done it because they were engineers and they had thought about the situation and they had done what engineers do. On Titan, a materials science team published a paper describing a new process for producing high-tensile carbon composites at 1/3 the previous energy cost. The paper was published openly in the Human Scientific Archive. It was not classified. Within 6 weeks it had been integrated into 17 shipyard production processes. The Keth Hegemony's intelligence service obtained a copy of the paper 8 months later and found it described exactly what it said it described. On Lock 7, Captain Adaora Iwu brought the Indus into orbit and found that the agricultural infrastructure site below was considerably more developed than any public record had indicated. She spent 3 hours going through the site's inventory with the site director, a quiet man named Ferreo who had been there for 6 years, and she came to understand that Ferreo and his team had not been waiting for the crisis to begin preparing for it. They had been preparing for it as a matter of routine, the way you prepare for winter by cutting wood in summer, not because winter is certain to be harsh, but because the cost of preparation is lower than the cost of being wrong. How long? She asked him, standing in the dome's central hub while outside the terraformed wind moved across the Lock 7 plains, still thin but no longer purely hostile. How long have we been ready? He considered. Define ready. Ready to be on your own. Ferreo looked out at the plains. We were on our own when we got here, he said. We've been figuring out how to be less on our own ever since. The Council's Enforcement Working Group met for the first time 6 weeks after the vote. It was not, technically, an enforcement working group, it was called the Human Compliance Implementation Committee, which was more polite. Its mandate was to determine how to actually operationalize Proposal 879. The working group included representatives from 8 Council species and had access to the full Council military registry, which was to say the combined registered forces of all member species. This was a considerable force. On paper. The problem the working group ran into for sessions in was geography. The human sphere of occupation, even the officially registered one, was larger than any single council species occupied. The unregistered sites, now confirmed, made it substantially larger. To establish an actual blockade, to intercept actual vessels, to enforce actual restrictions against an actual population spread across 9 star systems, you needed more ships than the council had ever projected would be necessary. You needed sustained patrol routes. You needed logistics lines. You needed, in short, to dedicate a significant fraction of everyone's military resources to a project that would take years to implement and that, the working group's military specialists noted, quietly and with some discomfort, had a non-trivial probability of provoking a response. What kind of response? Asked the working group chair. The military specialists looked at each other. One of them, a Theresi officer who had attended a joint training exercise with human naval forces 8 years ago and had not forgotten it, said, "We don't have a good model for it. That's the issue." The thing about humanity, Voradesh had written in the section of her report that nobody had read carefully enough, was that they were not actually unpredictable. Their individual behavior was often chaotic, their politics often baffling, their cultural production often incomprehensible. But their collective behavior, under pressure, followed a pattern. A consistent, documented, historical pattern. They got very quiet. They got very focused. And then, eventually, they got very large. The working group adjourned without producing a timeline. Its next meeting was scheduled but never held. The Miru were not an impressive species by council standards. Their home system contained one habitable world, one marginal moon, and a belt of resource-poor asteroids that made their early industrial period longer and harder than it needed to be. They were bipedal, bilaterally symmetrical, approximately human-sized. They had been compared to humans superficially and found the comparison neither flattering nor offensive, simply inaccurate. They had been council members for 300 years and had spent most of that time being politely overlooked. They had a long memory for slights. The Keth hegemony had absorbed 2 of their outlying stations during a border dispute a century ago. The council had ruled in the Keth's favor on a technicality, and the Miru had not forgotten. Councillor Desimir, the Miru's current representative, a being of advanced age and excellent posture, had voted against Proposal 879. This was noted. What was not immediately noted was that 2 weeks after the vote, she had formally requested and been granted a diplomatic consultation with Ambassador Yara Osei. The consultation happened at a location of Desimir's choosing, a small orbital platform that technically belonged to the Miru Diplomatic Corps but had been built, 3 decades ago, from components that had been supplied, under a trade agreement that was not widely remembered, by a human commercial enterprise. Yara had looked this up before the meeting. She thought Desimir probably knew she had looked it up. "We voted against the proposal," Desimir said, in a voice that carried the specific register of someone who has long since stopped performing civility and arrived at something more durable. "You know why? Because you believe the Keth's real objective is to reduce every non-hegemony species' autonomy incrementally," Yara said. "And you believe that humanity becoming a useful precedent is dangerous for you." Desimir's expression did not change, but something behind it did. "Among other reasons. Humans are also, this is blunt and I intend it to be, the first species in Council history who might actually be capable of pushing back effectively. We find it useful to have effective entities on our side of the ledger." "What does the Miru want?" "Access to your synthesis data. Specifically, the pharmacological work your teams have been doing this past month. We've been watching the output from your research stations. You've compressed a decade of analog work into 8 weeks." Yara was quiet for a moment. She had known about the synthesis acceleration. She had not known the Miru were monitoring it. In exchange for what? Navigational data. "We have 300 years of survey records the Council Cartography Authority has never fully indexed. Some of it covers systems that are not, technically, in our registration either. *****. The agreement between humanity and the Miru was never formally announced. It did not need to be. It existed in the practical domain of things that happen, accumulate, and eventually constitute reality regardless of whether they have been publicly ratified. What followed, over the next 4 months, was a series of similar conversations. Not all of them initiated by humans. The Fun Collective, the third vote against 879, sent a junior attaché with a very indirect opening that, once decoded, amounted to a request for a conversation about mutual logistics. 2 smaller species, non-voting observers in the Council, made contact through channels so circuitous that they were almost certainly deniable. A Theresi commercial entity, private, not government, its relationship to the Theresi Council representative carefully ambiguous, expressed interest in human-built ship components. None of this was alliance building in the formal sense. Humanity was not constructing a bloc. It was doing something more characteristic. It was finding out who was already unhappy and beginning to talk to them. Director Sandoval updated her infrastructure model. The numbers moved in several directions simultaneously. The pharmacological gap closed. The navigation data from the Miru revealed 4 systems with characteristics suitable for colonization that were outside the Council's current monitoring coverage. The Fun Logistics conversation produced, indirectly, a revised supply chain map that identified 8 route alternatives to Council-controlled waypoints. "We're becoming less dependent," she told the briefing group, with the specific flat effect of someone reporting facts that are significant enough not to require emphasis. "How much less?" Brecht asked. 8 months ago, a complete trade severance would have created critical supply failures in approximately 30 months. Current projection is that we would be self-sustaining within 14 months, with marginal discomfort but no life-threatening shortfalls. She paused. "If we accelerate the Lock 7 agricultural build-out, the timeline drops to 9 months. Keller, the budget administrator, was doing arithmetic in her head. "What does accelerating cost?" "Less than it did 8 months ago," Sandoval said. "The materials science paper from Titan saved us considerable expense." In the Council chamber, Praetor Dovanash was receiving updates that it found difficult to assess. Not because they were ambiguous, they were not, but because they described a situation that did not fit any precedent in Council history for how a species under censure was supposed to behave. The precedents all involved species that either complied or escalated, made concessions or made threats. Humanity was doing neither. Humanity was, with visible and apparently genuine calmness, becoming less reliant on the Council ecosystem with each passing month. Not through aggression. Not through violation of any rule that could be clearly cited. Through engineering, trade, research, and a quality of distributed organization that looked, from the outside, less like policy and more like weather. Dovanash had been in politics for 22 years. It understood leverage. The essential problem with leverage was that it required the other party to need something you controlled. As each month passed, the list of things the Council controlled that humanity needed grew shorter. The leverage was not disappearing. It was already gone. The Council had simply not noticed when it left. It requested a second meeting with Ambassador Osei. This time Yara did not make the Praetor wait 12 hours. She accepted immediately. She found, almost looking forward to it. The second meeting happened in the same room as the first, The functional conference suite on the Meridian Way station, same plain table, same unremarkable lighting. Yara had considered upgrading the setting and decided against it. The plainness of the room said something she did not need to say in words. Dovanash came this time with 2 aides, which was a tell. The praetor was operating under instruction, which meant it was no longer speaking freely, which meant the hegemony's internal conversation had progressed to the point of requiring deniability in at least one direction. Yara had brought Sandoval, who sat quietly to her left and said nothing, which was its own kind of tell. The council, Dovanash began, is prepared to discuss modifications to Proposal 879. Yara had expected this opening. She had discussed with Brecht and Sandoval and Keller what the appropriate response was. They had debated the options, firm demands, measured engagement, strategic ambiguity, and arrived unanimously at an answer that none of them had initially considered: patience. Genuine patience, not performed patience. The kind that came from not needing the other party to move quickly. That's good to hear, she said. What modifications? Dovanash presented a set of revised terms. They were, by the standards of the original proposal, considerably more reasonable. The escort requirement for vessels would apply only within certain defined zones rather than all non-human space. The trade routes would be reclassified but not formally restricted. The colony ships in transit would be permitted to complete their journeys under a provisional registration that would be resolved through negotiation rather than unilateral council decree. The terms were not what Yara had asked for. They were a significant step toward it. She read them carefully and said, "I'll need to consult with my government." "Of course," said Dovanash. There was a pause. Yara looked at one of the aides, a young Keth newly assigned, whose face was not yet trained to neutrality, and saw something there that she took a moment to identify. It was not calculation. It was not hostility. It was, she realized, curiosity. The aide was watching her the way you watch something that behaves differently than you expected and are trying to understand why. "Can I ask you something?" she said, looking back at Dovanash. The praetor's broad face registered mild surprise. "You may. What were you expecting us to do? After the vote? What did the council actually think was going to happen?" ****. It was not the kind of question you asked in formal negotiation. Yara was aware of that. She asked it anyway, partly because she was genuinely curious and partly because she had found, in 20 years of diplomatic work, that the moments when you broke the register of a conversation were often the moments when you learned something real. Dovanash was quiet for a moment that was slightly longer than comfort required. Then it said, "Compliance or protest? Formal petition. Perhaps withdrawal from council membership, which would have been manageable." "Manageable," Yara repeated. "Your economy was understood to be significantly integrated with council trade infrastructure. The medical dependencies were documented. The assessment was that isolation would produce internal political pressure for compliance within." The praetor stopped. Looked at her. "Within 2 years. 2 years," she said. "It was a reasonable assessment," Dovanash said, with something in its voice that was not quite defensiveness, based on available data. "It was," Yara agreed. "The available data was accurate. The dependencies were real. What the assessment didn't account for was what we do with a problem once we actually have one." She paused. "We've been having problems since before we left Earth. The problem usually just meant we worked harder and differently than we had before." The young aide was still watching her with that look. She glanced at him and said, more gently than she'd been speaking, "We're not angry. I want to be clear about that. Not most of us, not in the way that makes things difficult. What happened in that council chamber was clarifying." "Clarifying how?" the aide asked before catching himself and looking at Dovanash. Dovanash made a gesture that apparently gave permission. The aide looked back at Yara. "Clarifying in the sense that we now know something precisely that we had previously only suspected," she said. "We know what we look like from the outside. We know what concerns the council has about us. We know where the friction points are in specificity." She picked up her documentation tablet. "Before the vote we had theories. Now we have data. That's actually useful. ****. She consulted with Brecht and Sandoval and Keller for 4 days. The revised council terms went to a full human government assembly, a messy, contentious, very loud process that lasted 9 days, involved 112 hours of recorded debate, and ended with a majority decision to accept the modified proposal as a working framework while explicitly reserving the right to renegotiate specific terms within 18 months. It was not a victory. It was not a surrender. It was, Yara thought, watching the vote come in from the Meridian Assembly Hall's observation deck, The specific kind of outcome that looked like a draw from the outside and was something else from the inside. A new baseline. A recalibration of what the relationship was and what it could ask of them. The Indus landed on Lock 7. The Sao Paulo was 6 weeks behind it. The grain road had already unloaded and returned to transit, its holds refilled with the first agricultural export from the colony. A symbolic amount, barely enough for a single community, but grown in Lock 7 soil under a Lock 7 sun by people who had decided, 6 years ago, to go somewhere difficult and make it less difficult. In the Nairobi laboratory, the synthesis team published their analog compound data. Openly. In the shared archive. The Mirror downloaded it within 48 hours. 3 other council species downloaded it within a week, through channels so carefully indirect that they maintained complete deniability while being, in practice, perfectly transparent. None of this was defiance. None of it was victory. It was simply the shape that things had taken. 3 years after the vote, Voradesh, the Keth intelligence analyst who had written the unread report, was reassigned to a position studying human cultural output. It was considered a lateral move by her colleagues. She considered it the most interesting work of her career. She read history mostly. Human history, which was not short and not simple and which had a tendency, she found, to recur in patterns that were consistent enough to be instructive but different enough in surface detail to be consistently surprising. She read about plagues and recoveries. She read about economic collapses and the unexpected industries that emerged from them. She read about isolated communities, islands, mountain settlements, polar stations, eventually orbital habitats, and what happened to them over time. What happened over and over and over was, they adapted. Not always gracefully. Not always without loss. But with a consistency that, once you saw it, became difficult to unsee. The humans who ended up somewhere difficult had a remarkable tendency to make the place less difficult. Not by leaving but by changing what was possible within it. She wrote a second report. This one was shorter. Its central observation was, the species the council believed it was containing 3 years ago no longer exists. Asterisk. This was not metaphor. It was demography. In the 3 years since the vote, human population in non-Earth space had increased by 11%. This was partly natural growth and partly migration. People who had watched the council vote and concluded, with the specific pragmatism of people who do not wait for permission to act on a conclusion, that perhaps the frontier was a reasonable place to be. The colony sites that had been agricultural infrastructure were officially colonies now, most of them past the population threshold, all of them registered, the paperwork filed with a thoroughness that was almost pointed. The pharmacological synthesis work had continued beyond the crisis that catalyzed it. 7 of the 31 fan-sourced compounds had been fully replicated. 12 more were in advanced development. The remaining 12 were under study. The synthesis teams, having developed the methodology under pressure, found they did not want to stop using it when the pressure eased. They had, in the way that humans often do, become interested in the problem for its own sake. The shipyards were producing at a rate that the original drawer plans had projected as a crisis mobilization target. This was not crisis mobilization. It was, as far as anyone could tell from the inside, simply what shipyards did once you properly funded them and gave them good materials and left them alone to work. Sandoval updated her model. The infrastructure assessment that had been the rationale for the contingency plans had become, in the ordinary course of events, a description of normal operations. The contingency had become the baseline. The emergency pace had become the regular pace. She noted this in a memo that was precise, brief, and which she suspected most of the people who read it did not fully process, because it described a change so gradual and so distributed that it was almost impossible to see if you were looking at any individual part of it. You had to look at all of it at once. Admiral Brecht retired 4 years after the vote. He gave a short speech that mentioned none of what had actually happened, because he was not a man given to speeches about what had actually happened. He was a man who had done what was necessary and found that sufficient. He went back to Meridian's second moon, to the habitat where he had grown up, which had been expanded considerably in the intervening decades and which now smelled less like emergency oxygen reserves and more like a place where people lived. Yara stayed in diplomatic service. She renegotiated the modified Proposal 879 at the 18-month mark, as the Assembly had reserved the right to do, and came away with terms closer to her original position. She did this twice more over the following years, each time from a slightly stronger position, not because she was brilliant, though she was, but because the circumstances behind her kept changing in the same direction. She never stopped finding it strange, the thing that the Council had set in motion. Not the expansion, not the independence, not the industry, though she had expected. What she had not quite expected was the quality of attention. The way a species that had always been somewhat distracted by its own internal conflicts, its political noise, its cultural chaos, became, under the specific stimulus of external pressure, extraordinarily focused. Not unified. Not homogeneous. Not simple. But focused, the way water through a narrow channel moves faster than water in a wide plain, without losing any of its essential nature. The Council had looked at humanity and seen the problem. Too large, too fast, too inconsistent, too difficult to integrate. They had tried to constrain it. What they had not understood, what Voradesh had tried and failed to communicate in 14 pages that nobody important had read carefully, was that constraint was not a neutral force on this particular species. It was a stimulus. It was the thing that woke up what had been sleeping. Asterisk. Desimir of the Miru lived to be very old, by the standards of her species, and was known in her later years for a particular remark she made often, to students, to colleagues, to anyone who would listen and seemed worth educating. She had been asked once, early in the post-vote period, what she had understood about humans that the Council majority had not. She thought about it for a while. Then she said, every species in the Council reached the stars and believed that arrival was the significant thing. That reaching space was the culmination. Humans arrived and treated it as a beginning. She paused. It sounds like a compliment. It is also a warning. A species for whom everything is a beginning does not have an end point you can negotiate them to. There is no final destination you can block them from reaching, because they have not decided what it is yet. The student who received this remark wrote it down. It circulated in Miru academic networks for years. Eventually, translated, modified slightly, attributed to various speakers, it reached the broader Council information channels, where it was read by an analyst in the Keth hegemony who forwarded it to Dovanash, by then retired, who read it in a garden on the Keth homeworld in the warm middle hours of an afternoon. The praetor read it twice. Then it set it down and looked up at the sky, which was a clear deep blue, the color of deep water. Somewhere in that sky, at distances its imagination could comprehend but its certainty could not, there were now dozens of inhabited human worlds. There would be more. There was no particular reason to think this would stop. It had not expected this. It had expected compliance or conflict, the two modes it knew. It had received neither. What it had received was something it did not have a word for in Keth and which translated only awkwardly into common tongue. A species simply continuing. Through opposition, through isolation, through pressure, through every incentive to stop or shrink or concede, simply continuing. Moving forward in the way that water moves through the smallest available gap. Not because it has chosen to, not because it is brave, but because that is what water does. The universe, Dovanash thought, was probably large enough for all of them. It would need to be.